Sometimes the bravest battles begin after everyone else has already given up. That was the sentence quietly written on the first page of a worn notebook left inside room 417, though no one remembered who had placed it there. For 93 days, Lieutenant Ethan Walker had remained in the same hospital bed at St. Andrew Medical Center outside Norfolk, Virginia. Once an elite Navy SEAL known for leading impossible rescue missions across hostile coastlines, he now lay motionless beneath crisp white blankets, his eyes fixed on a ceiling he had memorized long ago. Doctors had stabilized his body weeks earlier, but hope was a far more fragile thing than bone or muscle. Neurologists called his condition permanent. Specialists from across the country reviewed his scans, held conferences, and quietly agreed that no treatment remained worth pursuing. Insurance representatives approved fewer therapies each week. Physical therapists stopped scheduling new sessions. Even the volunteers who read to long-term patients gradually stopped opening the door to room 417. The silence inside had become heavier than any diagnosis. Nurses exchanged sympathetic glances whenever his name appeared on the assignment board, often requesting different patients instead. It was never spoken with cruelty. They simply believed there was nothing left to do. His chart had become a collection of routine observations instead of possibilities. Outside his room, life inside the hospital never slowed. Trauma pagers echoed through fluorescent hallways. Stretchers rolled across polished floors. Coffee cups emptied and refilled beneath buzzing lights as another overnight shift blurred into another morning. Yet behind one quiet door, time itself seemed unwilling to move forward. Ethan had become part of the building, another permanent fixture like the faded family photographs taped beside his bed or the American flag folded neatly on the shelf beneath the television that no one ever turned on anymore. Few people even realized he had once worn the same flag on his shoulder in places most Americans would never see. They saw only another patient who could neither speak nor stand. They did not see the man whose decisions had once brought entire teams home alive. They certainly did not know why two plainclothes visitors occasionally stopped outside his room without entering, exchanging brief words before disappearing down the hallway again. Hospital administrators assumed they were distant relatives. Security assumed they worked for the government. No one ever asked. Then, just after 2 a.m. on a rain-soaked Thursday, a new name quietly appeared beside room 417 on the overnight nursing schedule. Emily Carter, 31 years old. Transferred from a small regional hospital less than 6 months earlier. Calm, efficient, almost invisible. She rarely joined conversations at the nurses' station. She never complained about difficult assignments. She volunteered for patients everyone else considered hopeless. When another nurse glanced at Ethan's room and sighed, Emily simply picked up the chart without saying a word. She paused outside the closed door for a moment longer than anyone noticed, resting one hand lightly against the file as though recognizing something no one else could see. Before she turned the handle, the hallway behind her remained filled with ordinary hospital sounds. By sunrise, nothing inside St. Andrew Medical Center would feel ordinary again. Emily Carter pushed open the door with the same quiet confidence she carried through every overnight shift, and the room greeted her with the familiar stillness that had convinced nearly everyone else to stop expecting change. A soft monitor rhythm filled the silence, accompanied by the distant hum of the hospital ventilation system, and the muted sound of rain tapping against the window overlooking the parking garage. Ethan Walker remained exactly where every chart said he would be, motionless beneath neatly folded blankets, his broad shoulders now softened by months of inactivity, his face calm enough that a stranger might mistake him for someone peacefully asleep. Emily did not begin by reading the electronic chart. Instead, she studied the room itself. The framed photograph beside the bed showed Ethan standing with several men in desert camouflage, but every face except his had been carefully blurred with a black marker. On the windowsill rested a small wooden challenge coin display containing only a single coin, although the empty grooves suggested there had once been many more. A faded paperback novel remained open on page 68 exactly where someone had left it weeks earlier. Dust had begun collecting on the cover. Emily noticed every detail without appearing to notice anything at all. She checked the intravenous line, adjusted the blanket by only an inch, and verified the medication pump with calm precision before finally lifting Ethan's wrist between both hands. Most nurses counted pulse rate almost automatically. Emily closed her eyes for 2 full seconds, Her expression never changed, but something in her posture subtly shifted, as though she had confirmed an expectation rather than discovered new information. She gently returned his hand to the bed and looked toward the window where rainwater traced slow lines across the glass. Outside, a medical helicopter crossed the dark sky on its approach to another hospital several miles away. For a fraction of a second, Emily's eyes followed it with unusual focus before she quietly returned to her work. At the nurses' station, the overnight staff continued their routine conversations. One resident reviewed laboratory results, while another complained about another double shift. Charge nurse Linda Brooks noticed Emily had been inside room 417 longer than expected. Smiling politely, she walked over and leaned against the doorway. "You do not have to spend so much time in there," she said softly. "His condition has not changed in months." Emily looked back only briefly before answering in the same calm voice she always used. "Sometimes charts take longer to change than people do." Linda gave a sympathetic smile, assuming the younger nurse was simply being compassionate. "You will learn," she replied gently. "Eventually you have to accept what medicine cannot fix." Emily nodded respectfully. She did not argue. She did not offer another opinion. After Linda walked away, Emily quietly reached into the bedside cabinet to organize supplies. Hidden beneath several unopened tissues and an old magazine lay a sealed military envelope addressed only with Ethan's name and a delivery date from nearly 12 weeks earlier. The envelope had never been opened. Emily stared at it for a brief moment before carefully placing it exactly where she had found it. She knew enough not to disturb things that someone had deliberately left untouched. Then, almost imperceptibly, Ethan's right index finger twitched beneath the blanket. It lasted less than a second. No alarm sounded. No monitor changed. No one outside the room noticed. Emily did. Emily did not call for another nurse when she noticed the movement. She did not press the emergency button or announce her observation across the hallway. Instead, she quietly reached for a small flashlight from her pocket and performed the same neurological assessment that had been documented dozens of times before, except her movements carried an unusual confidence that came from experience rather than routine. She checked Ethan's pupils, observed the smallest change in his breathing, and lightly touched the back of his hand before waiting several seconds longer than most clinicians would have considered necessary. Nothing happened at first. The room settled back into silence. Then his heartbeat increased by only a few beats per minute, before returning to its previous rhythm. Most people would have dismissed it as a random fluctuation. Emily simply made a mental note and continued without the slightest sign of surprise. As she adjusted the bedside monitor cable, her eyes briefly rested on a thin scar running along Ethan's left forearm. It was old, nearly hidden beneath months of pale skin, but the location caught her attention. She had seen scars like that before, not inside hospitals but in places where medical care had been improvised under impossible conditions. She looked away almost immediately, careful not to linger. Every action she took remained completely ordinary to anyone watching through the hallway window. A nursing assistant stepped inside carrying fresh linens. "Poor guy," he whispered while folding clean blankets. "He was some kind of military hero, right?" Emily continued organizing medications without looking up. "That is what I heard." The assistant sighed. "Hard to imagine someone like him ending up here with nobody around anymore." Emily paused for the briefest moment before answering. "Sometimes the people who served beside you believe they are honoring your privacy." The assistant smiled awkwardly. "Maybe." He finished replacing the linens and left without another question. Emily watched the door close before quietly opening Ethan's chart on the bedside computer. She ignored the lengthy diagnostic summaries and instead reviewed the admission timeline. Every examination had focused on what Ethan could no longer do. Every consultation described limitations, deficits, or permanent loss. Only one line buried inside an early nursing note caught her attention. It had been entered by an emergency department nurse during the first hour after Ethan arrived nearly 3 months earlier. The note simply read, "Patient appeared to respond briefly to familiar military terminology before sedation." No physician had referenced it afterward. No follow-up evaluation had explored it further. Emily read the sentence twice before closing the record without leaving a comment of her own. Down the hallway, Two men wearing business suits entered through the secured elevator reserved for authorized visitors. They carried no flowers, no gifts, and no visitor badges clipped to their jackets. They spoke quietly with hospital security before disappearing toward the administrative offices instead of the patient rooms. Emily noticed them only in passing as she delivered medication to another patient, yet something about the disciplined way they scanned every hallway reminded her of people trained to observe far more than they revealed. An hour later, she returned to room 417 carrying only fresh water for the bedside humidifier. She stood beside Ethan for several silent moments before speaking in a calm, conversational voice that sounded less like a nurse addressing a patient, and more like someone refusing to let another human being disappear into silence. "I think you are still listening," she said softly. "You just have not found a reason to answer yet." Ethan remained perfectly still. But beneath the blanket, hidden from every camera angle inside the room, one finger curled ever so slightly toward the palm. The storm outside eased into a light drizzle as the first hint of dawn remained hidden beyond thick gray clouds, leaving the hospital suspended in that strange hour when exhausted night staff counted the minutes until shift change. Emily Carter continued her rounds with the same quiet rhythm that had earned her almost no attention since arriving at St. Andrew Medical Center months earlier. She answered call lights, checked medication schedules, comforted anxious families, and completed every task with careful precision. No one would have guessed that her thoughts repeatedly returned to room 417. Shortly before 4 o'clock, Chief Neurologist Dr. Richard Bennett entered the intensive care unit carrying a tablet filled with morning reports. He stopped outside Ethan Walker's room and glanced through the glass before shaking his head almost imperceptibly. "No changes?" he asked without looking away from the patient. Charge nurse Linda Brooks sighed. "Nothing significant." Emily thought she noticed a slight response overnight, but there is nothing we can document. Dr. Bennett gave a polite but weary smile. "Hope is a wonderful thing, but medicine requires evidence. We cannot keep searching for progress that is simply not there." Emily happened to be passing with a medication cart and heard every word. She did not interrupt. She simply continued walking until Dr. Bennett called her name. "Miss Carter." She turned immediately. "Yes, doctor." He stepped toward her with the calm confidence of someone respected throughout the hospital. "I appreciate your dedication, but you should focus your energy where it can truly make a difference. Lieutenant Walker's condition has been reviewed by specialists across the country. There are no hidden answers left to discover." Emily met his eyes with complete respect. "I understand." "Good," he replied. "Compassion is important, but unrealistic expectations can be difficult for everyone involved." With that, he walked toward the next patient room, already reviewing another chart. Before he reached the door, Linda offered Emily an apologetic smile. "Do not take it personally. He has seen hundreds of cases like this." Emily nodded once. "I know." She said nothing more. She did not defend herself or argue against years of medical experience. Instead, she quietly finished stocking supplies before returning to Ethan's room carrying only a fresh blanket and a small portable speaker requested by another patient who had been discharged the previous afternoon. The speaker had never been collected, so it remained on the supply cart. Emily placed it on the bedside table without turning it on. Her attention drifted toward the unopened military envelope still resting inside the cabinet. She removed it carefully and examined only the outside. There was no return address, no military branch, only Ethan's full name typed in plain black letters. The seal remained perfectly intact despite months of waiting. She returned it exactly where it belonged. As she adjusted the blanket across Ethan's shoulders, her eyes stopped at a faint indentation near his left collarbone, almost invisible beneath the hospital gown. It was not an injury. It looked more like the long-healed pressure mark left by years of carrying heavy equipment in the same position. Emily recognized the pattern immediately, though her expression never changed. At that exact moment, the door opened without a knock. A well-dressed man carrying an expensive leather briefcase stepped inside wearing a visitor badge issued only minutes earlier. He smiled politely, but his eyes swept across the room far too carefully before settling on Ethan. "Good morning," he said warmly. "I am an old family friend. I heard he was finally stable enough for visitors." Emily looked at the visitor badge, then at the man and finally back toward Ethan. Something about the introduction felt rehearsed. She returned the smile with perfect professionalism, but deep inside, a quiet certainty settled into place. Whoever this man was, he had not come because of friendship. Emily offered the visitor the same professional smile she gave every family member who entered the intensive care unit, but she did not step away from Ethan's bedside. The man extended his hand with practiced confidence. "Daniel Mercer," he said. "Lieutenant Walker and I go back a long way." Emily shook his hand briefly. His grip was steady, yet his palm lacked the rough calluses she had come to associate with years of military field work. More importantly, when he looked toward Ethan, there was recognition without familiarity. It was the expression of someone studying a file rather than remembering a friend. "It is good that someone came," Emily replied calmly. "He has not had many visitors lately." Mercer nodded almost too quickly. "I have been overseas on business." His answer arrived before the question had even been asked. Emily simply acknowledged it with another polite nod. "Would you mind giving us a few minutes alone?" Mercer asked. "I would like to speak with him privately." Emily glanced toward Ethan's monitor before returning her attention to the visitor. Hospital policy requires staff to remain available for patients in this unit, especially those who cannot communicate. Mercer's smile remained, but it became noticeably thinner. "Of course." He pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down. For nearly 2 minutes he said nothing. His eyes wandered across the room, lingering on the unopened envelope inside the bedside cabinet, the challenge coin display, and the patient chart resting on the computer stand. Emily noticed that he never once looked directly into Ethan's eyes. Instead, he seemed interested in everything surrounding the patient. After another minute, Mercer casually asked, "Has there been any improvement recently?" Emily answered with careful neutrality. "His condition remains under evaluation." "Any unexpected responses?" he continued. "Sometimes patients surprise us." Emily folded a clean towel before placing it neatly on the supply cart. "Every patient deserves that possibility." Mercer studied her for a moment longer, as though measuring every word she chose not to say. Before he could continue, the overhead paging system announced that visiting hours would not begin for another 3 hours. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and reached into his briefcase. "I brought something that might help him remember." He removed a framed photograph showing Ethan standing beside 3 other men wearing outdoor jackets near a mountain lake. The image appeared ordinary at first glance, yet Emily immediately noticed one detail. Every person in the photograph smiled naturally except Ethan, whose posture remained alert despite the casual setting. Mercer carefully placed the frame on the bedside table. "Perhaps familiar faces will help." Emily looked at the photograph only briefly. "That is thoughtful." As Mercer prepared to leave, he paused beside the door. "Please let me know immediately if he wakes up." Emily answered without hesitation. Family members listed in his records will always be contacted first. A nearly invisible flicker crossed Mercer's face before he recovered his smile. "Naturally." He walked into the hallway and disappeared around the corner. Emily waited exactly 10 seconds before stepping to the bedside table. She lifted the photograph, turned it over, and found no handwritten message, no date, and no names. Only a brand new manufacturer label remained attached to the back of the frame. It had been purchased recently. The picture itself looked older, but the frame had never belonged to Ethan's room before that morning. Emily quietly returned it to its place and looked toward the security camera mounted above the doorway. She had the unmistakable feeling that someone was not merely checking on a patient. Someone was trying to confirm whether Lieutenant Ethan Walker could still recognize the people standing beside his bed. The intensive care unit slowly filled with the sounds of a new day as the morning staff arrived carrying fresh coffee and overnight reports. Yet Emily felt as though the hospital had quietly shifted in a direction no one else had noticed. She finished documenting Ethan's routine observations exactly as every protocol required, leaving no mention of the subtle finger movement or the slight changes she had witnessed during the night. There was not enough evidence for a medical conclusion, and experience had taught her that extraordinary observations deserved patience before they deserved attention. Shortly after 7 o'clock, The physical therapy team entered room 417 for their scheduled evaluation. The therapist completed a familiar series of passive movements while discussing discharge planning with another clinician just outside the doorway. The long-term rehabilitation facility confirmed they can accept him next week. One of them said quietly, "There is not much more we can realistically accomplish here." Emily remained near the medication station without interrupting. She listened, then watched as the therapist gently finished the session. Before leaving, he looked toward Emily with genuine kindness. "You have been spending a lot of time with him. Do not blame yourself if nothing changes. Some battles simply end differently than we hope." Emily offered a respectful smile. "Thank you." She neither agreed nor disagreed. After everyone left, she returned to Ethan's bedside carrying only a clean washcloth and a fresh pitcher of water. She performed each task deliberately, speaking only enough to explain what she was doing, even though every chart suggested he could not respond. "The weather cleared this morning," she said softly while adjusting the blinds. "The helicopters will probably be busier today." For the first time since she had met him, she noticed the faintest change in his breathing. It was almost impossible to detect, lasting no more than 2 steady breaths before returning to normal. Emily remained perfectly still. She had seen similar reactions years earlier in patients whose minds remained alert despite bodies that refused to cooperate. She reached toward the small portable speaker she had placed on the bedside table the previous night. Rather than playing music, she connected it to an audio recording of gentle harbor sounds she had found in the hospital wellness library. Waves rolled softly across distant docks while gulls called somewhere beyond the shoreline. The room remained peaceful, but Ethan's pulse climbed by 3 beats per minute before settling again. Emily quietly turned the speaker off. "Interesting," she whispered, not as a diagnosis but as an observation. A few minutes later, she picked up the framed photograph Daniel Mercer had left behind. She studied each face carefully before her attention settled on the background. Behind the 4 men stood a weathered wooden sign pointing toward a trailhead. The lettering was partly hidden, yet one word remained visible: Chesapeake. Emily's eyes narrowed slightly. Ethan's official service history listed assignments on the West Coast and overseas, not training near Chesapeake. The photograph did not fit the story recorded in his file. She placed it back exactly where Mercer had left it. As she stepped toward the door, she caught a faint reflection in the hallway window. Daniel Mercer was standing at the far end of the corridor pretending to read a bulletin board, but his eyes were fixed on room 417. He was not waiting to visit again. He was waiting for something to happen. Emily looked once at Ethan, then back toward the distant figure. Without speaking another word, she quietly locked the electronic chart on the bedside computer, closed the room door halfway, and made a decision. Before anyone else accepted another explanation about Lieutenant Ethan Walker, she was going to find out who Daniel Mercer really was and why he seemed far more interested in Ethan's future than in his recovery. The opportunity arrived just before noon when the intensive care unit became unusually busy with 2 emergency admissions, drawing physicians and nurses toward the opposite end of the hallway. Room 417 briefly disappeared from everyone's attention except Emily's. She stepped inside, quietly closed the door until only a narrow gap remained, and stood beside Ethan without reaching for a single piece of medical equipment. There was nothing left to measure, nothing left to chart. If she was right, the next step had nothing to do with medicine. She studied his face for several silent seconds. His expression had not changed, yet the tiny differences she had observed throughout the night refused to leave her mind. The increased pulse at familiar sounds, the slight change in breathing, the almost invisible movement of one finger. They were not enough to convince a hospital. They were enough to convince her that someone was still listening. Emily looked once toward the hallway to ensure they were alone. Then she leaned slightly closer, keeping her voice barely above a whisper. "If I am wrong," she said softly, "nothing changes. But if I am right, you only need to do one thing." She waited. The monitor continued its steady rhythm. Outside the room, footsteps echoed past without slowing. Emily remained completely still. She did not repeat herself. She understood that pressure often produced silence instead of answers. Nearly 30 seconds passed before she spoke again, this time using a calm tone that sounded strangely familiar. almost as though she were repeating words practiced long ago. The mission is over. You are safe. Ethan's breathing remained steady, but one muscle along his jaw tightened for only an instant before relaxing again. Emily saw it. Most people would never have noticed. She slowly reached toward the bedside rail, resting one hand lightly against the cool metal. Her expression remained composed, but her eyes sharpened with quiet certainty. She had seen condition responses before. Not inside civilian hospitals, but in men and women trained to ignore pain, fear, and even their own bodies until they heard something they trusted. She closed her eyes briefly, searching her memory instead of the chart. There had always been another layer beneath official names. Another identity reserved only for those who served together. The unopened envelope. The missing challenge coins. The photograph that did not match the service record. Daniel Mercer's rehearsed smile. None of it fit unless Ethan's real history had been carefully hidden from almost everyone around him. Emily opened her eyes and took one slow breath. I know this sounds impossible, she whispered. But I think you have been waiting to hear the right voice. Then, without hesitation or drama, she quietly spoke a single word. Viper. Nothing happened for a heartbeat. Then another. The room remained perfectly silent except for the monitor. Suddenly Ethan's right hand closed just enough for his fingertips to press against the blanket. His pulse climbed noticeably on the screen. His eyelids trembled almost imperceptibly before becoming still again. Emily did not call for help. She did not celebrate. She simply watched, knowing exactly how extraordinary that response truly was. At that precise moment the door began to open. Daniel Mercer stepped into the room, froze when he saw the monitor, and for the first time since arriving at the hospital, the confidence disappeared from his face. Emily slowly turned toward him and with complete calm spoke only 4 words. You are not his team. Daniel Mercer did not answer immediately. His eyes shifted from Emily to Ethan, and then toward the cardiac monitor where the subtle increase in heart rate still remained visible. The carefully rehearsed confidence he had carried into the hospital only minutes earlier was gone. I think you are misunderstanding the situation, he finally said, keeping his voice calm enough that no one outside the room would notice the tension. Emily did not move from Ethan's bedside. No, she replied quietly. I think I finally understand it. Before either of them could speak again, 2 uniformed hospital security officers appeared outside the partially open door, accompanied by Chief Neurologist Dr. Richard Bennett. One of the nurses had reported an unusual discussion inside the room after noticing the elevated heart rate on the central monitoring station. Dr. Bennett entered first. What is happening here? He asked, looking from Emily to Mercer before stopping at the monitor. His vital signs changed, Emily answered evenly. I would like another neurological evaluation before anyone authorizes additional visitors. Dr. Bennett frowned. Based on what? Emily met his eyes without hesitation. Based on direct patient response. Mercer stepped forward with an impatient smile. Doctor, I believe the nurse is simply emotionally invested. Lieutenant Walker has not regained consciousness. Before Dr. Bennett could respond, the overhead speaker announced that 2 federal representatives had arrived requesting access to the intensive care unit. Within less than a minute, the hallway outside room 417 became unusually quiet. 2 men wearing dark navy jackets entered. Alongside the hospital administrator, their identification badges displayed only official seals and names. One introduced himself simply as Commander Nathan Brooks of the United States Navy Medical Liaison Office. The second carried a slim black portfolio that never left his hand. Commander Brooks looked directly at Ethan before turning toward Mercer. Sir, may I see your identification? Mercer hesitated only briefly before producing a wallet credential. Commander Brooks examined it silently, then handed it to his colleague without expression. Thank you, he said politely. Would you mind waiting outside for a few minutes? Mercer looked toward Emily, then toward Ethan once more, but offered no argument. He quietly stepped into the hallway. The door closed behind him. Commander Brooks immediately faced Emily. The charge nurse informed us there was an unexpected neurological response. Emily nodded once. There was. What stimulus produced it? He asked. Dr. Bennett folded his arms, expecting to hear another description of routine testing. Emily remained silent for several seconds before answering with complete honesty. I addressed him using a military identifier that I believed he would recognize. The room became perfectly still. Commander Brooks exchanged a brief glance with the man holding the black portfolio. "What identifier?" he asked. Emily looked at Ethan, whose breathing had become noticeably steadier than it had been all morning. Then she answered with one quiet word. "Viper." The portfolio never reached the table. The second official froze where he stood. Commander Brooks' professional expression disappeared for the first time since entering the room. "That designation was never included in any civilian medical record," he said slowly. Emily simply replied, "I know." Dr. Bennett looked from one face to another, suddenly realizing the conversation had moved far beyond ordinary hospital care. Commander Brooks drew a slow breath before speaking again, this time with unmistakable respect. "Miss Carter," he asked, "how do you know that call sign?" Emily lowered her eyes briefly toward Ethan before lifting them again. "Because," she answered softly, "it was the only name anyone ever used for him when the mission mattered most." For several long seconds, no one inside room 417 spoke. Dr. Richard Bennett looked as though years of certainty had been quietly rewritten in a single conversation. Commander Nathan Brooks never took his eyes off Emily Carter. Finally, he nodded once toward his colleague, who carefully opened the black portfolio and removed a sealed folder marked with a federal classification stamp instead of a patient label. He turned several pages before stopping on one that appeared almost completely blank except for a photograph taken years earlier. The woman in the picture wore military field gear instead of hospital scrubs. Her hair was shorter, her expression harder, but there was no mistaking the face. It was Emily. Dr. Bennett stared at the photograph before looking back toward the quiet nurse who had spent months blending into the background of his hospital. "This cannot be possible," he whispered. Commander Brooks closed the folder without allowing anyone else another look. "Officially," he said calmly, "this person does not exist in any civilian archive." Emily remained completely still. "Officially," she answered, "that is correct." No one asked another question. They no longer needed to. Every unexplained detail suddenly fit together. The calm under pressure. The unusual observations. The recognition of a call sign that had never appeared in a medical record. Even the confidence with which she had waited instead of rushing to conclusions now made perfect sense. Commander Brooks stepped closer to Ethan's bedside. His voice softened noticeably. Lieutenant Walker participated in a series of classified operations whose records remain restricted. Very few people ever knew the identities used during those missions. He turned back toward Emily. Fewer still survived them. Dr. Bennett slowly removed his glasses, still struggling to understand. "You knew him before this hospital." Emily looked quietly at Ethan. "Yes." "Did you serve together?" She waited several seconds before answering. "My responsibility was always to bring people home. Sometimes that meant treating injuries. Sometimes it meant making sure they remembered who they were." At that exact moment, Ethan's breathing changed once more. It was subtle but unmistakable. His fingers tightened gently around the edge of the blanket before relaxing again. Commander Brooks smiled for the first time that morning. "He heard you." Emily said nothing. She simply adjusted the blanket over Ethan's shoulder the same way she had done countless times before. There was no celebration, no dramatic announcement, only quiet relief. Outside the room, Daniel Mercer was escorted from the intensive care unit without protest after officials requested additional verification of his identity and authorization. The hospital gradually returned to its normal rhythm. Nurses answered call lights. Physicians resumed morning rounds. Families continued walking the hallways, unaware that an extraordinary story had unfolded behind one ordinary hospital door. Before leaving, Commander Brooks paused beside Emily. "The department appreciates what you did today." Emily gave a small shake of her head. "I did not do anything extraordinary. I simply reminded someone who he was." Commander Brooks nodded with deep respect. Sometimes that is the hardest mission of all. Later that evening, after her shift finally ended, Emily quietly placed the unopened military envelope on Ethan's bedside table where he would see it whenever he was ready. She turned off the room light, stepped into the hallway, and walked away without looking back. Behind her, in the quiet room that everyone had nearly forgotten, Ethan's lips moved almost imperceptibly. No sound came at first. Then, barely louder than a breath, one single word escaped. Raven. Emily did not turn around. She only smiled to herself for the briefest moment before disappearing into the evening crowd, leaving behind one more mystery than she had ever intended to reveal.